Welcome back to the ticket setup series. In today's session, we're going to focus in on ticket life cycles. Ticket life cycles allow for us to introduce business process across ticket. And these business processes can have different phases of work that allow for you to sequence and control the governance of those business processes. Some examples of different life cycles you might have in your business are software requests, new hires, terminations, emergency changes, standard change requests. And the idea here is that each one of these different life cycles can have one or multiple phases of work. And in each one of these phases can have one or multiple tasks and or approvals where you can control what's required to fulfill that particular request in your business. Now, in order to highlight how this all works, we're going to break up this part of the setup series into 3 sections. Section 1 is going to be creating the life cycle, which is what we're in right now. Section 2 will be linking that lifecycle to a template, which will make it available to both agents and end users. And then section 3 will be highlighting how life cycles feel across the different experiences, both the agent and the end user experience. So to create a life cycle, what we'll do is we'll travel over to the ticket agent portal, so web.tikit.ai, and we'll navigate over to settings, and we'll go to lifecycle. Now, once we're in Lifecycle, we'll go ahead and create a new Lifecycle. And this is where you can create any type of business process. In today's example, we're going to focus in on a new hire process. And the first thing it's going to ask us is to name that process. So we want to be descriptive here, not too long, but crisp. And we'll call this new hire. Now, you can have a description for some more words or summary. I'm going to not fill that out. It's optional, but you can add that if you like. The next thing you're going to be asked for here is whether or not you want us to auto-resolve your ticket if a lifecycle completes or fails. Now, most of the time you're going to want to keep this enabled, but sometimes you may want to control the resolution of a ticket if a lifecycle completes or fails, and that gives you the option to do that. Now, once you fill the title description and whether or not you want us to resolve the lifecycle, you're going to then start building out the different phases of work for a life cycle. Now, in my life cycle, I'm going to have 2 phases. I'm going to have an approval phase and a provisioning accounts phase. And I'm going to highlight a few things around this life cycle and how we would create it, and then we're actually going to build it out. So you can have one or multiple phases for a life cycle, and to add a multiple phase, as simple as clicking add phase there. And then you're going to give the opportunity to name these different phases. Now, these names are going to be what surface visually inside of the product. And it's going to give you the visual description of what phase you're in. So it's really important to be descriptive but crisp here. And for this first phase, I'll just type approval, which will be my approval phase. Now we're given the option to add tasks, approvals, or Power Automate tasks. So tasks are my ability to delegate different work to agents within the product. Approvals give me the ability to send approvals to anyone in the business. So just to highlight that real quick, agents are licensed agents within Tikit, where approvals are any end user across Microsoft Entra. We also have the opportunity to introduce Power Automate tasks inside of a phase. Now, all of these, you can have one or many, and same with Power Automate tasks. And what a Power Automate task allows for us to do is to actually send up the request to Power Automate to go do something. Now, there is a whole section in the setup series under Power Automate on how to work with Power Automate tasks. In that example, in the setup series, we actually create a Power Automate task to create an Entra account after an approval phase occurs. I would definitely recommend traveling over there to see how this all works inside of Power Automate. But for today's session, we'll be focusing in on tasks and approvals. So in my approval phase, I want to add a new hire approval. So I'll go ahead and select add approval here, and I'll start building out the approval. So for the title here, I'll just call it new hire approval. This is what the actual approvers will see. For approvers, again, I can send this to any end user in the business. This is looking up your users in Entra. For me, I'll just add Diego and Adele. You can keep it to the context of the people working inside of the setup series. I also have the option of requiring everyone to respond. What this ultimately means is that everyone has to approve and or reject to action this approval. And the additional details are just that, just additional details. Please approve. Now, once you're satisfied with the constructs of the approval here, you'll select add. You'll evaluate that phase. And if you're happy with that phase, you'll move on to the next phase. Now, I already added phase 2 here, so I'm just going to start tweaking and changing this phase here based upon my need here. Now, my second phase is my provisioning accounts phase. So what I'm saying here is that after the approval occurs, then the provisioning accounts phase will happen next. One thing I should have highlighted as well is that this approval here is static, meaning I'm telling this business process that these approvers need to approve this every single time this initiates. We can do dynamic approvals. And I mentioned this earlier, but in the Power Automate section of the setup series, there's a whole area on how to add dynamic approvals. And I would suggest checking that out if you want to do that. Now, for the provisioning accounts phase, I'm going to have 2 tasks. The first task is going to be creating an Enter account. You could also see that the assignment is a little bit different. I mentioned it earlier, but this is assigning to agents here, licensed agents. And I'll just go ahead and assign that to Diego here. And then the second task we'll do is provide Teams access. I'll also assign that to Diego here. Now, just like approvals, tasks can also be dynamically added. So what do I mean by that? So maybe in a new hire process, you're asking the agent or the end user which department this employee belongs to. And maybe they belong in operations as an example. Well, maybe in operations, you need to have an additional account set up for an application specific to that business unit. You can dynamically add tasks based upon form submission or ticket metadata. Just like for approvals, that dynamic capability is done via Power Automate. And I would recommend going over the Power Automate section to check out how to add those dynamic tasks. So for my provisioning accounts phase, I have my 2 tasks, my create enter account and my provide Teams access. And for this phase, I'm pretty satisfied. So to review, I have my 2 phases, approval and provisioning accounts. The next thing I want to highlight here is transitions. So transitions allow for us to evaluate when a phase moves from one phase to the next, and then be able to manage what happens during that transition. Now, we also have the opportunity to rename our transitions. The reason why you would want to do this is because this part also surfaces itself visually in the Lifecycle admin area, and it's just a nice and clean way to see how things flow. And I'll show that to you once we save this. So for this one, for the transition name, we're just going to call it move to provisioning accounts phase. Now, I'm actually going to keep this to the default one. I'll create logic builder, custom logic in my next one. So my default logic here is basically once all tasks and Power Automate tasks as well as approvals are approved, I want to move to the next phase. So in the provisioning accounts phase, I'm going to rename this to complete new hire. And what you'll see here is I have the option to choose use default logic or use logic builder. Now, if I choose to use logic builder, I'm given the opportunity to evaluate what's happening in that phase based upon the tasks and or approvals that are there. And based upon that, I can choose what happens when one of those items, in this case, my tasks, enters a certain state. So let's just say that, for example, providing Teams access, if that fails, what do I want to do? So by default, if that fails, I'm going to fail out the lifecycle. But maybe I want to capture it and pause it and then do something with that evaluation of a failure. This also applies for approval. So if something gets rejected, maybe you want to do something with that. And that do something is actually in the action area. And what you're given the opportunity to do here is move to a different phase across your life cycle. So the options you have here are, maybe if that fails, you're okay with moving to the next phase. Maybe you want to move to a previous phase. Maybe you want to move to a specific phase. In any scenario, when you decide to move to a certain phase based upon a certain task and or approval hitting a certain state, you can choose where that goes. You can also enter a message. So let's say that when that fails, I want to move back up to the approval phase, and maybe I want to have a message travel with it. Say, please reevaluate particular request. And the idea here is that you can give context to what's happening when something is moved back up to a previous phase or moved forward to a certain phase. Now, in this life cycle, I'm actually going to use default logic here, but we just want to highlight the control and power you have to branch things and control the flow around the transition evaluation for tasks, approvals, or Power Automate tasks. Now, once you're happy with your life cycle, you can go and click Save here, and that will save the life cycle. Now, I have a couple of new hire life cycles, so once that saves, we'll go and evaluate the one we just created. And you'll see here, here's my new hire process I just created. Now, the one thing I want to highlight here is this is an example of how those names show up. So here's the title, here is the different phases, and then here is the transition names that are highlighted. And then you have what's happening inside each one of those phases. So the approval and the two tasks here. So that concludes this part of the setup section. We're going to move to part 2 in the next part of this setup series, where we're going to actually link this lifecycle to a template. But I hope you enjoyed this session and looking forward to seeing you on the next one.